Hi, Sarah. It's good to see you.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thank you.
Am I a bit early or?
No, perfectly in time.
Okay.
I'm just gonna start in half a second, Sarah.
No worries.
We're recording this session, Sarah. Hope that's all right with you.
Of course, yeah, that's fine.
Great. So welcome to the Wunderkammer program and a very, very warm hello to Sarah. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak to us today. I'll give a brief introduction. Sarah has been teaching in sustainability and urban planning at RMIT since 2004. Is that right, Sarah? Since 2004?
Yeah, a long time.
She's an Australian interdisciplinary conservation scientist with a background in conservation biology and experiences in social sciences, planning, and design. Her research interests focus on the intersection between science, policy, and the design of environmental management. The application of her work on the preservation of biodiversity in cities has included working with the Green Building Council and looking to develop a Green Star rating system for biodiversity in building, which has led to the Biodiversity Sensitive Urban Design Protocol. Over to you, Sarah. We'd love to hear your work.
Great, thanks. Well, I was actually going to share my screen with some slides. Is that okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Maybe just let me know that everything's working and I'll just try doing that. Desktop. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
If I do that, is that okay?
Yes, we can see it.
Great, okay. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to present to you. I'm assuming you're all industrial design students, is that correct? Is it industrial design focus, isn't it? Just so that I've got it clear in my mind. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk to you today about some work that we've done for the last sort of probably decade, I suppose, around the idea of embedding nature in the urban fabric of cities. This is pretty different sort of idea that sort of, to be honest with you, has only recently become something that is a real focus of attention. But I think the thing that's happened in recent times is that people have started to acknowledge that cities are really going to be facing unprecedented challenges moving into the future. For some cities, it's just about clean air, drinkable water. Others, it's about how we kind of maintain habitability in the face of more and more extreme weather events. And then obviously just exponential population growth, or actually in some places, industrial kind of decline, if you like. But in either of those times, in either of those places, there's a massive challenge in keeping people healthy and happy and connected, and having environments that are kind of resilient to these kind of future challenges, and current challenges that we really face. And so a lot of attention has been focused on the idea of urban forests and urban greening, green infrastructure. They're all sort of nature-based solutions. They kind of mean the same thing as a key part of the solution, using nature to help create resilience in cities and help connect people to nature and to each other, and to help sort of mitigate some of the challenges that we're going to face. And there's a lot of interest from urban planners, designers, and the like, in the best ways of actually going about doing this, how best to embed nature in the urban fabric to deliver the benefits that we know we can that people can achieve. And this figure here really just highlights, I suppose, some of the key benefits that have been now very well established in the literature and are now kind of accepted, I suppose, in the world of urban planning and design as being, key reasons for wanting to motivations for wanting to bother with this pursuit. Now, as I talk, please feel free to ask questions or interrupt me and get me to clarify something. And we can also have questions at the end, but I'm very happy to take questions as I go as well. So yeah, on the right there is a bunch of benefits really of urban greening, ranging from cooling the city. So say for example, the city of Melbourne uh, is motivated by the fact that modelling shows we can reduce the overnight temperature and heat waves by about 8 degrees with an urban forest strategy that they've designed. So that's a big reduction in potential morbidity and mortality from heat waves in cities just by having an urban forest. The health and well-being benefits are well studied and documented now, and they're extraordinary, really. If you live in a street with more trees, you're less likely to have heart disease and diabetes. Your children will have less likelihood of asthma and allergies. Kids playing in school grounds with more biodiversity have improved cognitive development and lower incidence of behavioural issues like ADHD. Even for that reason alone, there's massive interest in I find it intriguing that these benefits exist to the kind of magnitude that they do. What are the kind of mechanisms that link human health and well-being to nature? And there's some really interesting sort of theorizing in that space that's emerging in the literature. The psychological well-being benefits are perhaps even more compelling. Psychological restoration and just the reduced incidence of mental well-being issues in cities with more everyday nature experiences. We call it everyday nature because the idea is that it's not just about having big parks and gardens and rivers with vegetation and the like, where people have to, escape from the urban jungle to get to these places, but it's actually having the city itself as being, having nature embedded in the fabric of the city. And I think we'll get to this later in the talk, but industrial design is going to play a really key role in how we achieve that vision of everyday nature. There are some big challenges. It's a really different way of thinking about a city. I mean, until recently, industrial designers, architects, even landscape architects were kind of trained on the premise that cities were places that we sort of keep nature out of, to keep us safe from nature, if you like. Keep the tigers and the predators away from us, and actually create safe places. And it's only kind of probably in the last couple of decades that it's dawned on us that we actually thrive a lot more if you have nature alongside where you live. And so it does, in some respects, require the discipline to flip its thinking in terms of our engagement and our relationship with nature. The second one there is future proofing for climate change. I talked about the 8 degrees cooler, but also vegetation in cities can reduce the negative impacts of storms and flooding events, and even storm surge and sea level rise can be mitigated through, say, having ocean related kind of vegetation, like mangroves, for example, have played a key role in protecting cities from cyclones and sea level rise and the like. I'm going to talk about the other benefits in a sec. But as I mentioned, this is a vision that we created of Fisherman's Bend, with kind of the idea of everyday nature sort of as a key motivating design element, if you like. And I'm really passionate in understanding how all this kind of enthusiasm for urban greening intersects with biodiversity. Because the reality is you can fill a whole city with trees and have very little benefit for plants and for biodiversity, if you like. You can have a monoculture of plane trees, for example, that provide quite little benefit to the native fauna of Melbourne, as an example. And so how do we maximise benefits to biodiversity in the way that we roll out urban forest strategies? And I think there are 2 key reasons for doing that. The first is sort of, hang on. This slide was actually just to tell you really that the global investment in trying to understand best ways to use nature-based solutions for cities is massive. This is just one example of a project that I'm actually involved in. I'm really fortunate to be involved in. It's a 36 million euro project that's looking to experimentally implement nature-based solutions in 3 European cities and sort of look at best ways of maximising the benefits of nature-based solutions. So we're working in Valladolid in Spain to look at how we use vegetation to reduce temperatures. We're looking at Izmir in Turkey, and that's kind of really flood mitigation is the main motivating factor. And then Liverpool in the United Kingdom. And then actually the main motivation in that city for nature-based solutions is trying to kind of reinvigorate a kind of declining retail district. So using nature-based solutions to actually, get people back on the streets and, and buying stuff, if you like. So very different motivations, but this is just one of multiple European projects that are similarly kind of funded. And Europe isn't the only place that's investing in nature-based solutions, know-how. Many countries around the world are really interested in this space. But as I said, I'm particularly interested in how that intersects with biodiversity. And the two key reasons why I'm interested in that is, firstly, that, weirdly in some respects, cities are hotspots for threatened species. So these are just some of the critically endangered or endangered species that we share the environment with in Melbourne. So powerful owl, that might be one that you've interacted with potentially. You've got the growling grass frog on the bottom there. At the top there is the Frankston spider orchid. Only occurs in quite a small area of Frankston. And so obviously, unless we accommodate the needs of the Frankston spider orchid in Frankston, it's going to go extinct. And many of these things will do so as well. A lot of these species are urban dependent, so they totally depend on habitat in cities. Others have kind of used city habitat because their other habitat has declined substantially due to clearing for agriculture, for example. But for whatever reason, cities in of themselves are really critical places for us to do conservation. So how do we build cities to accommodate their needs is a key conservation issue. But it's also enlightened self-interest, because more biodiverse urban greening is actually better for us. It's like turbo boosted urban greening, if you like. So here's an example of a study that was done in Adelaide that looked at biodiverse plantings in parks and the links to our healthy immune systems. So the theory is that having biodiverse vegetation in parks actually leads to a more biodiversity in the soil microbia, which actually impacts on our own health through our immune systems. And in fact, that's actually one of the kind of dominant kind of mechanistic pathways that people talk about that is theorized, the link between nature and health. Maybe something that you're not interested in particular as industrial designers, but I'm fascinated by this idea that that nature is just so good for us, and why that is. But also, we can have more resilient urban forests. They'll be more resilient to insect attack and potentially temperature rises if we have more diversity in the urban forest. But another key reason is that, city biodiversity is some of the only way that we have to connect people, to re-enchant people with the very idea of nature. Some of the courses I teach, I take people on field trips. Sometimes it's the first time that people have been to, a national park outside the city, and that's quite common now. So our our cities, our populations around the world are becoming increasingly urbanised. So unless we can enchant people with the idea of nature, with nature in cities, then we're kind of losing a huge opportunity for people to bother or care at all for nature. Here's a book that we wrote for kids, actually, that came out of a survey of insects that we did for the city of Melbourne. And this is used in schools now around Melbourne and actually Victoria to sort of excite kids about the insects they can find in their schoolyards or backyards. And there's also kind of, I think this is an underestimated aspect of what I'm talking about, is is that nature and biodiversity in cities can generate a sense of place and connection. You know, I mean, sometimes when I used to fly a lot, you know, you'd come back into Melbourne and it's sort of, you could see the vegetation from the window as we were about to land, and you'd get out and it's that smell of the eucalypts, and there's actually a sensory thing of biodiversity in cities and a sense of place that I think is really underestimated. How can we make Melbourne a unique place to exist in? And I think biodiversity is a real sort of secret to that. There's also the notion that we can use biodiverse urban greening and urban forests to connect people in Melbourne with our Indigenous history and culture. So we worked with the City of Melbourne to try and help them generate a list of species that they wanted to bring back into the City of Melbourne. And a key issue for them was having species that are culturally significant. So this Murnong yam daisy, for example, a key kind of food source for, you know, for the first Australians in Melbourne. Or this is a really boring looking butterfly, I suppose, but it's got an even more boring name. It's called the common brown butterfly. But this thing once used to emerge in great numbers at the start of one of the 7 Wurundjeri seasons. And the vision is that we could have that again, you know, in Melbourne. And it's a signpost. It's saying that's the start of that season. And so connecting people through biodiversity to understanding and respecting Indigenous culture. So I think there are multiple motivations for doing this that are now, you know, really quite well recognised. Oh, actually, this is one last little slide, just an extra little motivating factor. This is a very hot off the press piece of work that we just did. A student of mine, Matthew Solinsky, and he was looking at what are the kind of industrial, or what are the sectors of Australia's economy that are driving the most biodiversity loss. And he looked at everything from, you know, food production, mining, all aspects of our economy. And the top 3 are to do with construction and building. And, you know, basically the sort of things that I'm talking about, as I think, so these are the things that either through their footprint or through the materials that are used in the construction of those buildings, they're having the most impact on Australia's biodiversity. So it's another really strong motivating factor. Let's try and modify our designs so that we, you know, have less impact in terms of our footprint and less impact in terms of the products and materials that we use in construction and building. Okay, so that's a kind of compelling vision, I hope. Hope you found it compelling. But, you know, it will not happen by accident. We need to have very intentional strategies to link design to biodiversity. You know, as I said, you can fill a city with trees and have very little impact on biodiversity. You might achieve a small part of those benefits. You know, you might actually have shading, for example, and cool a city. But then, you know, you might have an urban forest that isn't particularly resilient when it comes to insect attack or the next drought or, you know, temperature rises, for example. But if you want to achieve the maximum amount of benefit, all those health benefits that I talked about, the benefits of sense of place, you know, enchanting people with nature, then we've actually got to think about urban design to enhance on-site biodiversity, improving the likelihood that things will persist in the landscape, you know, after we've undertaken the design. And that's the whole motivation of this protocol that we designed called Biodiversity Sensitive Urban Design. Importantly, it moves away from, you may not have heard of this concept, but there's a concept called offsetting. Has anyone heard of that as a planning mechanism? Maybe not. But the idea of offsetting is that it's okay to kind of erect a suburb and knock down all of its vegetation because we're going to actually, you know, plant some vegetation elsewhere and offset the kind of biodiversity loss through that kind of process. But that's a really flawed process. I mean, it's super flawed ecologically because, you know, a lot of biodiversity is place-based. You know, you're not going to have powerful owls just sort of flying off to find the next bit of forest that you've planted, and they might have to wait 200 years before it has the right characteristics for it to be able to inhabit those that new forest that you've just planted. So ecologically, it's utterly flawed. It doesn't deliver good outcomes, and we know that. But also, it just fails to deliver that everyday nature idea that I just described. You're basically saying this vegetation is worth nothing to the suburb that we're about to develop. It's not an asset, it's a problem. Let's get rid of it and offset it. And so instead, we call it onsetting. Biodiversity sensitive urban design is onsetting. It's seeing every bit of nature that you have in an area as a massive asset, something to be maximised through the planning and design process. And how can we do design that's actually going to preserve what we have and enhance what we have, bring species back, create kind of, we call it regenerative sort of urban form, if you like. And it's a pretty kind of straightforward process, but I'm just going to take you through some of the steps and describe how you kind of go about doing this biodiversity sensitive urban design. And some of these aspects you'll see immediately are really kind of key areas where industrial design could fit in. So you start by investigating your site. Well, that's often done from a perspective of, what's here and are there any threatened species that we have to be worried about? What are the biodiversity problems that we have to kind of try and offset? That's not what I'm talking about. Investigating your site is actually really understanding what used to be on your site as much as what is on your site now. What are the things that have disappeared from your site recently? Even if you're in a highly urbanized environment, what was the ecosystem originally on the site that you're going to be working on? And this process is relevant at multiple scales. So you might be talking about a whole city, you might be talking about a suburb, or you might be talking about renovating a Victorian building in Fitzroy. It could be at any of those scales where you can do this. So understanding what used to be on your site or what is on your site. And then thinking about what your objectives could be. That's your next step there. And being really specific about it. Do we want to, preserve X, Y, and Z species? Or do we want to bring back a particularly culturally significant or charismatic species? Or do you want to use some species to provide a key service? So, for example, microbats can eliminate mosquito problems really easily. If you can actually accommodate microbats in your design through clever kind of nesting boxes, for example, in buildings, then you can have less of a risk of mosquito-borne disease in an area. And so in the objective setting exercise, and actually this is we've done a lot of these types of exercises now with different developments. And it's a really key opportunity to engage your stakeholders in a profound way. So, for example, we ran an objective setting exercise in Fisherman's Bend to try and settle on some key biodiversity, some species or ecosystems that we wanted to try and protect or enhance. Thinking about which species are going to be ecologically feasible, which ones are going to have conservation value. That might be about economics, that might be economically useful species. Certainly cultural significance and social acceptability. These are all things that would play into your decision making. But you can use a visioning exercise. So in Fisherman's Bend, we had a lot of stakeholders who really didn't know much about biodiversity. A lot of them were engineers or water authorities or planners and the like. And so we also had traditional owners and friends of group, a whole swag of people who were really interested in this site and what sort of biodiversity objectives would come up with. And we actually got them to think about what you'd want Fisherman's Bend to look and feel and sound and smell like if nature had successfully been integrated into the urban fabric. And people talked about it wanting to feel, cool in the summer and warm in the winter, and being able to kind of hear bird song and being able to see water shifting kind of and see the seasons kind of, in the landscape through, and also it's a tidal area. So they wanted to see water moving. So that was the kind of lived experience. And we thought we brought that down to actually some quite specific species objectives and ecosystem objectives, knowing that that's what people wanted in terms of the lived experience of the site. It was really powerful because people got behind that vision, knowing that it was going to actually be a really compelling and enchanting place to, exist. So that objective setting exercise, people don't often set biodiversity objectives for buildings or suburbs. It's a very rarely undertaken step. So it sounds really simple, but it's very underdone and it's powerful. So then you have to design for your chosen species, and this is probably the place where industrial design can come in most usefully. So in the one, we talk about 3 things that you should design for: the resources that the species or ecosystems need, the threats that you need to try and mitigate, and then the connectivity that you need to provide so that they can move around the landscape. So in terms of resources, it might be just having streetscape vegetation that's diverse. You know, if you look around anywhere that you are currently living, you might be lucky enough to have a street tree, but how often do people have a mid-story? Very, very rarely. How often do people have an understory? Extremely rare. But, you know, there's absolutely no reason why we can't have that. I mean, we actually planted outside the front of our place here in North Fitzroy, we've got a plane tree, and we planted a big box around it and have kind of put in a kind of mid-story and an understory. And people love it. It's beautiful. It's all the native vegetation of this particular area. And it provides habitat for things. You know, we have more insects that visit that little patch than you'd really imagine. It's extraordinary. But if every tree had a patch like that under it, it would be a really beautiful, but also much more biodiverse street. So thinking creatively about street trees and vegetation. This is an industrial design problem, you know, is it how can you find opportunities in the streetscape for nature? You know, we've been talking to the City of Melbourne, for example, about, you know, all of the kind of outdoor dining that has been set up, and are there ways of having innovative designs to have biodiversity in those kind of outdoor dining kind of constructions, or, you know, rubbish bins even. I mean, you know, these are the kinds of things that people are thinking about as opportunities, and certainly kind of green roofs, green walls, roundabouts, you know, CBD courtyards, schools. Schools are such an underdone opportunity for biodiversity. I mean, you know, if you've got a kid yourself, you'll know that if someone told you more biodiversity in your school and your kid's going to have improved cognitive development, who doesn't want to have biodiversity in their school, you know? It's a really compelling reason. So how do we design schools that allow biodiversity to thrive? I mean, schools are challenging because you've got little feet running around everywhere, and, you know, there are some certain designs that you want to do to minimize, for example, interaction with dangerous animals like snakes, for example. But you can design for that. Really, it's possible. So that's actually one aspect of resources, is kind of native vegetation. So, for example, if you wanted to have blue-banded bees in our street in Melbourne, then you'd want to have certain types of vegetation in your understory, enough kind of flowers. Like they really love to have flax lilies, for example, that they buzz pollinate. And so if you can plant flax lilies, you might get blue-banded bees. But blue-banded bees also need earthen kind of banks to build their nests in. So you could have earthen banks, or you could have mud brick fences, you know, or some component of a house design that actually integrates nesting opportunities for blue-banded bees. And that's the next type of kind of resources, I suppose, is actually intentionally designing your house to invite biodiversity in. This is a building in Jerusalem that has intentionally designed crevices for birds to nest, for example. Or this is even more compelling, if you like. This is a brick where birds nest here outside of the building, and there's a perspex kind of viewing area from inside the building, so you can actually watch the birds nesting. So that's to do with that, you know, whole re-enchanting people with nature. I mean, what a kind of wonderful thing. Kids would just sit there watching it all day long, I could guarantee it, if you had little birds nesting in that. I mean, I don't know if you followed the peregrine falcons nesting in Melbourne over COVID, but it was extraordinary. Like 20,000 people every day were watching these birds trying to, you know, laying their eggs and then them hatching and then fledging, and it was extraordinary. But it was on a high-rise building in the centre of Melbourne. people are naturally drawn to these kinds of experiences, and if we can design to enhance those interactions, then I think we've really succeeded. Then there's the threats. So, the urban fabric is actually a massive threat to biodiversity on the whole. So, through excessive lighting or sound or, collision. So this is looking at bird-friendly glass, for example. Tilting your windows down so that the birds sort of see the ground rather than the sky. It just eliminates bird collisions on glass. Or there are other ways of actually creating glass that have a sort of mesh that birds can see that we can't. That's a real kind of why all glass isn't like that is just beyond me. I mean, but there's a real industrial design challenge. How do we create glass and other kind of problems? How do we design away the problems that the urban fabric kind of often poses to biodiversity? And so the lighting, for example, is another one. Different spectrum lighting will interfere more or less with for example, insect migration, or moths and bats, for example. So having, I think it's more like blue spectrum lighting, don't quote me on this, but is better in terms of it just interfering less with animals. And interestingly, over COVID, there were kind of weird sort of increases in populations of animals in cities around the world. So you saw, like little penguins running down the streets of Cape Town, and deer in I can't remember what it was. I think it was somewhere in like Vienna or something, in the main street, and animals kind of venturing out and actually being able to feel less threatened by cities. And what was it about that made it less threatening, and how can we design to make that just an everyday kind of experience? This is a kind of frog underpass. So frogs get hit by cars on roads, but you can design to have. You have to be very careful about it, but this is an underpass for frogs to get to their little wetland over here. But you have to funnel them in, so you actually have to almost think like a frog, and they don't like to go into dark spaces because they get scared there's going to be a snake or something, I suppose, something to attack them. So they have to be a bit moist, and then also not too dark. So you might want to have some sort of perforation somehow, so that there'd be a bit of light coming in. Anyway, if you understand what frogs, how they behave, then you can design to try and mitigate the threat of roads on frogs. So I've gone through resources now and threats. Now let me talk tiny bit about connectivity. So connectivity is basically how animals will see an environment to move through. And animals need to move. Often it's to forage. They want to get to a new location to eat. They might want to find a mate. They might want to. It might be that you have birds that have to leave their home and find a new territory. But for multiple different reasons, animals need to move around the landscape. And so, for Fisherman's Bend, for example, we helped them design streetscapes so that the key species that they were interested in protecting would have some chance of being able to get from A to B safely. And again, it's really thinking about the ecological needs of those species. So, for example, if you wanted to have fairy wrens and Fisherman's Bend moving around the landscape, then you need to have a mid-story in all of your streets. So mid-story of kind of like sort of prickly shrubs, I suppose, that they can hide in and feel safe in. And they are usually kind of beautiful flowering plants that would very, very low maintenance. So it's just a way of thinking a little bit differently about the resources you'd provide in streetscapes to make sure that they could be, like transport routes for animals as well as for people. And then after you've designed for your species, you can evaluate your design. So this is kind of ex ante, or kind of proactive kind of evaluation, thinking about what you're likely to achieve if you actually undertake these actions. So we have multiple different ways of actually trying to evaluate designs, ranging from really technical models. So this is one we did for the legless lizard, trying to evaluate what are the different actions you'd undertake to have any hope of having legless lizards on a site after you've done the development. And a really key thing here was actually cats. Trying to reduce the impact of cat predation on legal lizards was a really key factor in making sure that they could stay on the site. But if you can't do that kind of modelling, then we also use expert elicitation. So we, for example, did this for grasslands, get a whole bunch of experts in the room, and using a sort of technical process of expert elicitation, you can actually estimate what the likely benefits are of different actions. So for grasslands, you really need to think carefully about the pre-development process. If you leave a grassland to just in a state of neglect for 10 years, it might actually cross an irreversible ecological threshold, and you never be able to get it back. And so even before your development, you've actually got to start careful management of that grassland. But anyway, that's the kind of thing that you can get from an expert elicitation, or you can just do a literature review. So, this is the golden sun moth. There's a lot written about it. You can just sort of use the literature to try and come up with, best guesses of what the most important actions are going to be for that thing. And you can kind of come up with something like this, where you've got the different design elements. So whether they're design, construction, or inhabitation phase. So when I talk about inhabitation phase, it's things like having design that gets people to care for nature, cues to care it's called, or education, some sort of active stewardship program, or things like cats, for example. Whether you're going to be allowing cats in the area or not, or having cat curfews, and you can work out which for your biodiversity objectives, whether it's in this case grassland ecosystem, legless lizard, or golden sun moth, which are the elements that are most important to get right. So I'm finishing up in a second, but yeah, I think the key really is seeing people as part of the solution rather than part of the problem. How can we create urban environments where it's natural and desirable just to be a kind of positive biodiversity steward, if you like, in your own urban environment? Can we create places that enchant people with nature and generate the opportunities to care and bring back nature in the places where you're working and you're living and you're playing, even you're traveling, and these are just some ideas here of kind of architectural elements that would really promote, biodiversity in a design. There are also lots of super creative ways of getting people to behave differently in cities to encourage those positive interactions and to be part of the solution. This is a student of mine, Laura Moomore, who did her PhD on wildlife gardening, it's called. So gardening in your backyard explicitly to bring back a certain species, for example. And not only can it be a very powerful biodiversity conservation action if many people are doing it, but it's also quite beneficial to the people themselves who do the gardening. This is one survey that she undertook where she said she interviewed participants, and one of them said, "It's a wonderful thing. It's better than going to a psychiatrist." And that was a really repeated kind of phenomenon that people found it really, we all do want to be part of the solution, don't we? I mean, I feel like we live our lives just feeling that we're just, another reason why the planet is going down the drain. And being a part of the solution is a really sort of empowering and positive sort of aspect to this. So in summary, I think the future kind of habitability, livability, resilience, success of our cities, I think is going to, in some part, but depend on our ability to embrace this idea of everyday nature, where you can, on the one hand, have all of those threatened species and exciting, charismatic, culturally significant species thriving in a city rather than going extinct. And on the other hand, you've got people actually gaining a truly remarkable array of benefits from those interactions. And as I said, the key is in this everyday design. It's not just about having parks and riverside vegetation and big green corridors. They are important. But the key to having that kind of enchantment and engagement is having nature just in the urban fabric everywhere you look, incidental interaction. and feeling like you're part of the solution rather than part of the problem. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Sarah. That was amazing. Because I was just thinking, when as designers, we're always thinking of design from a human-centered point of view. And what you're talking about is, I mean, it completely blew me away because, now we're talking about design from a voice of animals, who don't really have a voice. So how, as designers, can we really incorporate, into our daily lives and make sure that not just for humans, but in the cities, we have more of an interaction with animals on a daily basis. And I'm sure many of the students have lots of questions for you. So I'm going to open the floor for a Q&A, if that's all right with you.
Absolutely, yeah. I hope that was the right kind of length of the talk. I don't know if I went over or under time, but anyway, yeah, happy to have as much discussion as people are keen to have.
Yeah, that was fascinating. I just, on what Vanya was saying, having to design from the animal's perspective is quite like an interesting approach to it. You don't often think like that frog thing. I would never have thought about that, but that's just like such a simple way to help such like a large group of things. So yeah, it's just like those simple things that are really cool that I enjoyed.
That's good, yeah. And actually, let me just say one thing. Animals is sort of part of the picture, but plants in some respects are much easier to design for because, you can design for, you can have bird boxes and bat boxes and they may never come, for whatever reason, they may never come. But if you plant plants, they're definitely going to be there, and they're quite, often native Australian vegetation is quite easy to kind of maintain, and it's beautiful and enchanting. We like that grassland stuff that I was talking about. You probably haven't heard much about grasslands, but it's the most critically endangered ecosystem in Australia, and it's around Melbourne. And it's easy to have in your front garden. You could have a critically endangered ecosystem in your front garden, and be actually having populations of species that are otherwise really going to go extinct. And that's a sort of very powerful, and industrial design that can actually create opportunities for those small spaces to be part of the biodiversity solution, I think is a really exciting opportunity.
Yeah, definitely.
Other questions, comments?
Sarah, I had a question. I thought it was, I've sort of always been pretty interested by like biodiverse architecture and all that sort of thing. Seeing how you see a lot of new buildings these days, how they have like, say, green roofs or sort of big things that jut out with big gardens. But I suppose one question I would have would be, how can we implement that sort of biodiverse architecture, but onto sort of maybe older buildings that aren't planned to already have those kind of additions to them?
That's such a good question. And I think if we only look at this as an opportunity for new suburbs, then I think we've missed a huge part of the design picture, because retrofits and renovations, I mean, they're often really key times that people could be doing that same process of biodiversity sensitive urban design. And yeah, I think there are, you talked about one example of kind of maybe the weight of the soil and the garden being problematic on an old building. But there are, I could tell you probably, 100 off the top of my head, similar kind of design problems that we need to try and overcome. And so, yeah, that's why it's exciting, I think, to have students like you listening to a talk like this that I'm giving, and hopefully kind of interested in working in that sort of space. And, that's just, you talked about one problem, but, often you get, I mean, people understand the motivations for wanting to have biodiversity where they live and work and play, but then it comes to the crunch and you actually try and implement it, and people will say, oh, it's too smelly, it's too noisy. What about the tree roots and the infrastructure? What about safety risk, if a branch falls on you? What about fire risk? What about what are the other things that people often go on about? Oh, how much water is it going to take? We don't have any water in our city. let me tell you, there are design solutions for every single one of those problems. I mean, take the water, for example. How are we going to water the vegetation? Well, there's actually a lot of kind of hydrologists who talk about places like Melbourne having too much water at the wrong times. So we have when it rains, the water just, because we've got concrete everywhere, the water just runs straight into the rivers, and it takes all of the pollutants from our streets. And there's this massive flush of water, which the rivers aren't actually used to having that much water so quickly going into them. And then it goes straight out into the bay, and you get these kind of problems with too much nutrient in the bay, and people can't swim in the water, and it's a problem. So if we could somehow work out how do we slow the water down, either capture it so that we can then irrigate vegetation, over the drier periods, or we can sort of actually just have water tables that can be soaked into in the city themselves. I mean, that they are design problems, but design problems that we need to kind of find solutions for, and people are already kind of working in that space. But every single one of those things that I just talked about has a design solution somewhere, and I think it's a really exciting kind of area to work in. Same with products. So, I talked about the construction industry having a problem with its kind of footprint, but also with the materials. So biodiversity friendly materials, I think, is another really exciting space. How do we create materials that are actually net positive for biodiversity, not just a kind of an impact on biodiversity? I think is another key kind of area.
Cool, thank you.
Pleasure.
Hi, Sarah. Thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. I was just wondering, being realistic with where we are at right now and kind of what's going on in our environment right now, where do you kind of see us going in, say, like the next 10 years' time? Like, what do you think is achievable in that kind of time frame?
I think a lot. I think, I mean, I am probably a bit of a nauseating optimist, but actually, every single day, just about, I'll get an email or some sort of connection from someone in the development industry interested in the ideas of biodiversity sensitive M design, or a council or someone like that. And if I had an entrepreneurial bone in my body, I probably wouldn't be working in the university anymore. But I really don't. But all I'm saying is, and we actually just got a grant. In fact, I think Symmetry might have mentioned we got this Ian Potter Foundation grant to try and sort of embed this idea in the development industry. And we're working with Lend-Lease as one of our major partners, and GHD, and then another kind of Yarra Valley Water, a couple others. And we're helping them do this for new developments. And then one's actually a kind of retrofit. So I don't know, I sort of think if we can demonstrate, we need demonstration sites to show that it's possible. And we need demonstration sites to kind of unearth sort of what the key design barriers are, and identify where we need to innovate. But yeah, I feel like there's enough motivation now from city councillors and the like to really drive this forward. So if we can provide the solutions, people will pick them up and use them. I've got no doubt about it. So yes, I don't know. I think the COVID thing, it's been dreadful, but actually I reckon people understand a little more the benefit of having interactions with nature. And I just sort of saw over COVID that there were people who had ready access to nature and people who didn't, and it was almost like a kind of environmental justice sort of issue. And so if people are also demanding it, then I think that's another kind of key part to the puzzle. And I'm hoping that people will actually see having nature in and around where they live as being a real benefit, knowing what it's like to live, sort of in isolation, and how much benefit you can gain from just having birds out your window, for example.
Yeah, I think if you talk to nearly anyone when they had the 1 hour worth of walking outside, I think everyone really appreciated nature around them. So thank you for that perspective.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are on what's possible in 10 years too. I mean, that's just my kind of optimistic sort of take on it. But yeah, and also I think kind of realistic. You know, when you've got Lend-Lease wanting to be the leaders in biodiversity sensitive design, they've got a long way to go. Don't get me wrong, but I think that's a pretty good sign, isn't it? You know, a huge kind of. I mean, they're a big development organisation, and I think if they start doing it and see it as a real benefit, then you know, surely the others are going to follow. Any other questions or comments or ideas?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. I just thought that to do with positive change, I think
Well, can you speak a bit closer to your device because I can't really hear you? Sorry. Oh, that's a shame. Maybe write your comment and I can respond to it as a comment if you wanted to.
Oh, sorry, I muted myself.
Oh, okay, you're back. Good.
Yeah. I just thought that people don't really, the general population doesn't really know a lot about this and the positive changes which are being made. I feel like the media is particularly dominated by the negative things and like loss of biodiversity, but we're not talking about how they're generally not talking about how it's being, because that's sort of more like if you're in industry you'd know about it, or for us they're studying. So I just think it needs to be put out there so more people know about it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And, you know, hopefully as we start to have some high profile examples of the ideas of biodiversity sensitive urban design, maybe I reckon that's when you know, media might actually become a bit more interested. You know? But yeah, I do agree with you. It's a sort of, I think it's a story, a hopeful story too, which, you know, we sort of are a bit desperate for at the moment, aren't we? You know, the time of climate change and all the rest of it. Any other thoughts or comments, anyone?
I think Zoli is asking about the boxes in Fitzroy North, where they are.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, so there's some comment. Where are the comments? I'm trying to find them. Should I be able to see them? Sorry, I don't think I can. Anyway, well, I mean, our street, we live in St George's Road South, so you can have a look at those ones there. But, you know, it's a similar kind of thing. A lot of it's kind of guerrilla gardening, so people just doing their own thing in their street. And, you know, lots of councils are now being much more accepting of that. As this Melbourne City Council have started actually creating spaces for people to do this, and sometimes it's more or less successful depending on who's living in the house. But there's a street, maybe it's Palmerston Street, I think, in Carlton, where they've dug out some of the pavement intentionally and planted, you know, and put some soil in so that people can plant their own gardens out on their street, on the nature strip as well. There was a guy called Adrian, what's his surname? I can't remember, from Melbourne Uni, whose PhD was all about nature strips and what an underestimated place they are for habitat. You know, and through clever design, you could actually have a lot more biodiversity if we just saw our nature strips as just not just grass, but sort of as places where we have biodiversity.
And I was also wondering, Sarah, so we talk about, you know, biodiversity, and I think there's a lot of I mean, in some ways we can really harness the community spirit. For example, when you mentioned the roofs or the green strips, but how do you really incorporate it at the policy level? I mean, how do we make it more substantiated? Because I assume for each place, as you said, it all depends. It's all about the place, and for each area there might be a different sort of intervention that might be needed. So can you really can we as designers really standardize how we look at biodiversity, or is it something?
Sorry, my daughter just came home from school. Yeah, look, I think it's a really good question, and I think there's multiple angles to that. I mean, I think having industry demand is really important, but then having certification, I think, is also, that's why I've been in part working with the Green Building Council, because I think if we can have clever and sophisticated certification around biodiversity, then that will actually motivate the industry. And then, so there's sort of more incentives, I suppose. And then I think we just need much stronger regulation. I mean, unfortunately, our planning system on the whole still sees biodiversity as being a bit of a problem. So a lot of our regulations around, how we, identifying that you've got a threatened species, and oh no, you've got one. Oh, you're going to have to kind of offset it now. And people fear finding a threatened species. I just think, oh my God, you should feel so lucky that you've got a threatened species, and you can design now to preserve it, and and have that as a kind of key feature of the place that you're designing. But there's not much incentive for the development industry to kind of do that currently, because in part our planning system is so kind of stuck in sort of multiple centuries ago. I think they need to get with it. And so they need to reframe biodiversity as being an asset rather than a problem, and and actually have decent regulations so that people can't just cut down vegetation without sort of having some serious outcomes. Get rid of offsetting altogether. I think people should be forced to kind of actually think innovatively about how you integrate biodiversity into design. And if you got rid of offsetting, it would happen a lot quicker than you'd think. So yeah, I could go on and on about the planning mechanisms and the sort of, but I think it's certainly both from the kind of incentives and rewards, but also from the regulation and let's just stop bad practices from happening. I think both need to happen. I mean, a lot of our design is so kind of boring and soul destroying. I mean, I suppose anyone would know if you've a lot of the new developments, but even a lot of the kind of knockdown rebuilds you see in the middle rings of our suburbs. You see just basically the whole block being taken up by a house, and really no opportunity for nature interaction. And people press the button on their carport, and the garage goes up, they drive in, they get out, and they go and sit in their home cinema or whatever. And that's really kind of not the type of design that we need. We need design that's kind of actually re-enchant people with nature and have a nature embedded in the urban fabric much more.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. And I just had, another question. So when you design for biodiversity, how do you measure the indicators? Because this is something that we can, gauge in the next year or 2 years. It might go on for a long time, and yeah, it's quite a difficult one.
That's such a good question, and it's something that is a major aspect of this Ian Potter Foundation grant, because having everyone knows how to measure the the biodiversity, the carbon benefit of a certain design. We can measure it in terms of carbon emissions or how much you're going to sequester or what have you, and we really do need simple equivalents for biodiversity. And at the moment, it's something that's complicated enough to capture. I mean, biodiversity is a complex thing, but also simple enough to be usable. That's a key kind of gap, I suppose, in our understanding, and it's one that we're currently doing a lot of work in at the moment. But even like a software package that enabled you to put in the right information and sort of evaluate how what the likely kind of biodiversity impacts of your site. That's another piece of innovation that's needed that we're currently kind of working on. But you're dead right, Vanya. It's a real problem that we don't currently have the right metrics for enabling biodiversity to be measured properly.
Thanks, Sarah. Does anybody else have any questions for Sarah or feedback, comments?
I did have one more question, Sarah. This is probably less of the actual design aspect, but I was just wondering what you thought the best way to just sort of, because you were saying with people, when you suggested solutions, people get a little bit iffy about all kinds of different reasons. I guess like the best way to actually encourage people to make designs and implement designs, so instead of just being conceptual models, they actually are real things that get implemented.
So is the question, how do we move from concept to reality?
Yeah, I guess, yeah. How do we sort of push that into actually making it a real thing and becoming more than just something a couple people do? How do we encourage people to actually take up these designs and make them real, I guess?
Yeah, well, that's kind of my mission, I suppose. I mean, that's what we wrote this kind of grant to the Ian Potter Foundation, to saying exactly that. We really want to mainstream this idea. So they funded us to try and do that. The way that we're doing it is, at the moment, is just working with developers on a couple of key case studies, and we think if we can actually get a couple of really good examples in the ground, built, constructed, and then monitor the outcomes for biodiversity and monitor the outcomes for people in those places where they're interacting with nature, and to demonstrate that they can work and that they can be relatively cost efficient and that people actually benefit from living in those spaces. I think that's the sort of evidence base that we need to kind of move from concept to reality, I think. But if you've got any other ideas, I'm very happy to take them on board. And if any of you want to have got research projects or whatever that you're keen to do, there's going to be heaps of stuff that we'll be doing. So get in touch if it's at all of interest. We're really keen to work with industrial designers to, because I think it's a key part of the solution, is having the right kind of clever designs.
Sarah, you might receive a lot of emails on that, I have a feeling, because your talk comes at the perfect time. We're 3 weeks into our course now, and at the moment we're looking at literature. So we're doing a literature review, and next week they'll start looking at the case studies. And maybe you want to mention some case studies they could look around Melbourne, and I think they'll be quite exciting for them to actually go to a physical space. And because all our classes have been online, so I think when you go to an actual site and you look at the how the impact of nature has been in that area, I think it's totally different from watching it on computer. So
sure, absolutely. Yeah, well, I'd be really happy to receive emails about it, so don't hesitate.
Okay, Sarah, thank you so much. It's been great. It's been absolutely wonderful, and I'm sure all of us learned a lot about biodiversity, and it's absolutely been a learning experience today for all of us.
Thanks. Absolute pleasure, and hope some of you will be in touch.
Okay.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you guys.
Bye.